The cultural unity of Western civilization has been compromised. It used to be the case that there was one unified high culture in Western Europe, basically from the Peace of Westphalia to 1789. The noble classes of all the various European states communicated with each other, intermarried with each other, discussed philosophy, art, all the different aspects, the real material aspects of culture, fashion. They discussed those things mutually, they communicated those things spread and homogenized in this one unified high European culture. The beginnings of science came out of that culture. The great modern philosophers came out of that culture. Western classical music, all of it has roots that go much further back, of course. There was a unified high culture in modern Western Europe that descended in a certain way from a unified high Hellenic culture, Romano-Hellenic culture, perhaps. The Pythagorean system of music theory was passed down, theories of geometry. The high culture of Greece was passed down among intellectual elites, high status people who communicated around the Mediterranean. That high culture was encapsulated in the monasteries, which survived the collapse of the Western Empire. And from those monasteries, this unified Mediterranean high culture was passed on to Western Europe, and it flowered there, achieving things that the Greeks never did. That was a unified, rooted tradition. That cultural integrity has been severed. Really, it was severed in 1789. And we have been reeling from that over the past 2 centuries. Today, we live in a culturally pluralistic society, a multicultural society, where the culture that you belong to, if you are of European descent, is largely determined by your purchasing habits, the media that you consume, the clothing that you wear, music you listen to some extent where you live, but the relevance of location is diminishing. The relevance of purchasing habits, that's increasing. Other groups, other ethnicities, it's more about that kind of traditional unified culture going back to a homeland. With the case of blacks in the US, there's a kind of synthesis of various African cultural elements, traditional American folkways that are blended together with a kind of commercialized aspect. And so it's different from the kind of cultural identities that European Americans typically belong to. There is a definite racial element for them, where that racial element is discouraged for European Americans. But overall, the cultural integrity of Western civilization has been compromised. If you value what Western classical music achieved, you have to think about how that will be carried on into the future. All of the achievement of contemporary music, electronic music, pop music, metal, every musical genre that you care about owes its existence to the achievement of Western classical musicians and theorists. They developed a comprehensive music theory out of that Pythagorean lineage, going down through the monasteries where they developed their systems of notation. They codified principles of counterpoint even back then. During the Renaissance, this stuff was explored. And as they gained more knowledge of Greek theories of music at that time, the available modes and kinds of genres of music expanded, and that continued to proliferate. Under that unified Western European high culture, there was patronage of institutions for the furtherance of the discipline of music theory as well. You got conservatories, you got places where musicians were trained. There was a court culture where there were jobs for musicians. It was a very significant aspect of the propaganda of that same elite. Opera, theater, music contributed and still contributes to the ability to project a message onto the people in general. But in any case, they developed systems of music theory and systems of music notation that allowed for all later genres of contemporary music. There would be no ragtime and jazz without Western classical music. Everything comes from Western classical music. And there's a lot that was lost in that transition to the more popular genres. A lot of it has to do with the theories of functional harmony that were developed during the late 1700s and 1800s, where counterpoint took a backseat to abstractions of harmonic function. And people thought about the vertical arrangement of notes in terms of fixed chords, fixed chord progressions, and that's just the kind of intellectual structure of music which dominated, accompanied by a shift to equal temperament. That's where you take the 12 notes of the scale and divide them exactly equally to minimize any dissonance that might occur in one key relative to another. In the past, systems like sixth comma mean tone were employed, which gave several very good acoustically perfect keys, or nearly acoustically perfect keys, key signatures, at the expense of some other key signatures, which ended up being more dissonant. And composers, using these slight differences between the key signatures, associated certain keys with certain moods. There was a subtlety to that older system of temperament that was also accompanied by that older notion of contrapunctal harmonic function, rather than the kind of vertical functional harmonies, phrase structures that were more a product of that classical period. In the Baroque, the previous periods, they used a subtler system of temperament. In vocal music, they would often use just intonation. People try to use just intonation today, but our ears are biased towards equal temperament, which kind of homogenizes the differences between keys, creates this kind of always uniform and monotonous effect. In the past, there was more color to the different key signatures. There were just more possibilities that related directly to the underlying ratios that allow for music, right? The different musical intervals are predicated on certain numeric ratios of frequencies. 2 to 3 in the case of a perfect fifth, 3 to 4 in the case of a perfect fourth. These ratios were explored by the Pythagoreans, developed in the Greek version of music theory that was then passed on, developed, etc. That foundation has been totally cut out. I went to the Eastman School of Music for French horn performance, but we learned all the different theory and stuff. And the standards for music education fell just while I was there over those 4 years. When I was there as a freshman, it was required that you would listen to a piece of music and dictate it. That was standard for hundreds of years in Western classical music education. By the time I was a senior, they would just give the students the piece that they wanted them to dictate, and so basically people would just memorize the piece and then the next day go in and write it down. They used to use the Fuchs Handbook of Counterpoint, which was read and used by Mozart, Beethoven, all the great classical music composers, Rossini. They used that classical text in an abbreviated form already. The full text that Fuchs produced covered music theory going back to those kind of Pythagorean ratios. It gave a whole context. It allowed you to tie in your theory of music to arithmetic, to this kind of harmony of the spheres. It was a unified worldview that had very robust roots. But the abbreviated version just kind of gave the rules of counterpoint, various exercises for the different species of counterpoint. And we had to learn out of that book. We had a class in counterpoint. Today, they don't use that book anymore. They don't teach counterpoint. They just teach the functional harmony. Things are just being geared more and more towards the kind of musical thought that we employ in contemporary music. And there is something that's lost in translation. When you listen to music that is mediated by electronic music, you lose a certain connection that is possible, direct connection with the musician who's performing the work. It's best to be in the presence of that musician. There's a quality that cannot be replicated through recordings, but the proliferation of recordings have lowered the demand for actual musicians, local musicians. If that heritage is allowed to pass, if no one knows how to temper a piano in sixth comma mean tone, that's going to have consequences. The reason why it all hangs together will be forgotten, and it's that Pythagorean root. It goes all the way down to metaphysics. It has logic. There's a purpose for it. There's a reason why we did things the way we did. The rules of Baroque music, classical music, existed for a reason. Today, we think of contemporary music in terms of innovation and what we can come up with. And we are moving further and further from the source of all of it. There is power in that source, however. And so it's not all bad news. What's happening right now is people who want to preserve Western culture tend to preserve and care about the most recent kind of Western culture. And they forget about that whole root and trunk of the tree. They're trying to preserve leaves, but leaves won't stay alive without the roots. The roots are what allows for the whole structure. You're not, in Carl Jung's opinion, you're not a modern man unless you've internalized the whole history. In my opinion, if you don't know Plato, you don't know philosophy. You don't understand our civilization if you haven't read Plato in depth and understood not just the surface level of the text, but the hidden doctrines. Understood that Pythagorean aspect, understood how that actually moved forward with the arts to produce everything that we've produced, everything that was exceptional in Western civilization. Western civilization is dying. There's appropriate tasks associated with each age of the individual life. The child is meant to play and learn and obey and expand their capacities as much as possible. Youths are meant to seek fame, reputation, do great deeds, and if you're a man, impress a woman. If you're a woman, display your sophistication and cultural elevation, display that you would raise cultured, high-status children. That's the ideal. And middle-aged people, you work, mostly just work, and sacrifice for your family. People in old age turn inward, reflect on what's ephemeral in life and what's eternal in life. Capture that eternal aspect, reconcile yourself to death, and communicate that deeper meaning of life, the more religious significance of life to the other ages of man, symbolically, in art, in stories. You tell stories, pass down traditions. Traditions embody the eternal element. So that's the function of old age. We are in the old age of our civilization. It's not time for great deeds and political revolution. It's not possible. It won't be fruitful. It will be an expending of the rest of our energies, which seems to have largely happened in the last few years. There was a capacity for a kind of last burst of cultural activity. It was spent on memes, bad internet cartoons, racist jokes, low culture. And it's not enough. If you care about Western civilization, you want to preserve something of it, you have to do what was done at the end of the Roman Empire, Roman civilization. Monasteries. If you care about Western art, culture, music, etc., you have to build institutions that are dedicated to furthering the disciplines and knowledge on which those arts are based. It's not optional. If you don't build physical schools where people live this culture, where they practice music every day, where they practice sculpture, painting, ballet, opera, all of it, philosophy. If you don't build well-rounded conservatories to conserve what is good and ancient in Western civilization, the spirit will be lost. It will be dead. And one day, some coming high civilization will look back on the record and they'll rediscover, and there'll be a renaissance then, but we won't be involved in it. You can be involved. You don't have to let your culture and people die out. You can save it, but not by giving money to grifters online, not by watching a bunch of YouTube videos, not even by making YouTube videos. You have to build schools. That's what it comes down to. You want to continue what we have going on here? Schools are the only way to do that. The left understands this. That's why they have infiltrated Western classical music conservatories. What the professors think there of music history, music theory, is completely antithetical to that ancient Pythagorean concept of a universal harmony. They advocate for chaos. They advocate for bending the rules, breaking the rules, always, innovation, further and further into creativity, I guess. But at a certain point, without that law, without logos, creativity degenerates into just chaos, static. So, yeah, institutions have to be built. There's no question about that. Communities have to be built around these institutions to allow them to exist. The left infiltrated elite musical institutions, orchestras, orchestra directors. A particular ethnic group specifically has enmeshed itself in those traditions and have forwarded these kind of antinomian, destructive tendencies in art. And they are eroding it from the inside out. And there's nowhere to go. If you value classical music, there's nowhere to go where the tradition will be affirmed in its totality, will always be critiqued. The associated culture, the high European noble culture, will be effaced And you won't have exposure to the true history, the true political history that was going on at the time, cultural history, philosophical history. It will not be given to you in mainstream institutions. You will be taught to hate it, and the music will never be performed the way it was performed at the time it was written. You'll never understand the mindset of Bach, Mozart. And so musicians won't be able to get in their mindset. And there's something salutary about getting in the mindset of those people. They lived in a saner age, an age without all these distractions, without the schizophrenic tendencies. They had a groundedness. When you play that music, there's a subtlety, there's a way that notes are related that requires so much attention, that trains you to attend to small differences. Whereas the kind of music people typically like today is a wall of sound that assaults you with sheer volume. And sure, there's a lot of complexity in different parts, but it's not a human scale complexity. You are now interfacing with a machine, a man-machine, cyborg, hybrid music that overwhelms the senses with super stimuli. And we forgot what actual human music sounds like. At least in its more elevated forms. Sure, you can listen to someone strum some chords on a guitar and sing a melody and it's quaint, and people still like that. People have a desire for this kind of stuff. The traditional European arts and culture, they love it, but they're not encouraged to love it because there are no institutions seriously dedicated to conserving it. We have to build those institutions. Hopefully I've made my case, but we also have to have novel research. We have to go beyond and continue growing that tradition. And it has to be holistic. It has to include the arts and culture, the humanities, the liberal arts. It has to include science, physics, and physics also has been skewed. Academic physics has gone in a particular kind of direction influenced by philosophies which have since been really debunked, and like logical positivism. And mainstream institutions have no interest in delivering a coherent cosmos to us, a vision of a coherent cosmos, the harmony of the spheres. They don't want us to have that because that's a source of psychological stability. That's a source of strength. And elites who want the planet for themselves, who want us to be their slaves, are engaging in full spectrum, asymmetrical warfare against us all the time. You're being attacked. You don't have a choice in this. You have to respond. And the way to respond is to get together, build institutions for the furtherance of European art and culture, spread that locally. You get people together, perform Baroque music, go to churches, play in the churches, play in local community centers all over the country, travel in a tour bus, collect donations, make it a source of revenue. Get an opera troupe together, a theater troupe together, get a ballet company together, travel the country, display what was great in our civilization, what was beautiful in our civilization. There's a lot of stuff that we did wrong too. There's a lot of faults in traditional European civilization. But at its core, what made it good was the good that was contained in it, the Platonic good, the oneness, the unity, the harmony that was contained in it. And we can't live without that. And everything that we achieve is burning through that kind of fossil fuel of the achievement of classical Western civilization. Once that fuel source is exhausted, we will be left as primitives rubbing sticks and stones together. And it doesn't have to be that way, because that fuel, in fact, is renewable. It's like the people who believe that oil just continually kind of grows out of the ground. It is that way with the font of classical European civilization. We can teach it. We can understand it again. A lot of the core of it is really Pythagoreanism, Platonism. Our whole civilization was built on it, and people neglect it at their peril. It's an immature thing. It's a tendency when you want to learn philosophy to kind of want to skip over the foundations. People don't want to read Descartes, for example, studying modern philosophy. They don't want to read Plato or Aristotle when they want to understand some aspects of classical philosophy. You come across as more educated if you learn a lot about some particular Stoic doctrine, or, Epicureanism, or, Gnosticism, or some obscure, like the core of it is mainstream and everybody knows everyone knows the name Plato. So I'm not displaying any status if I study that. That's the mentality of people who go for these fringe, obscure elements of Western civilization and ignore the core. You can't ignore it. That's the source of it. It won't exist without that. You have to build the institutions to continue it, or it will all go away. It will be a relic. It will just be there, rotting in the ground, until some future archaeologist goes back to take a look. If that even happens, or we're just full-on Planet of the Apes. It's totally up to you. The world can go many different ways all the time. The world that you experience is up to you specifically. It's never up to just everybody else. Your decisions determine the timeline that you experience. So you can decide to support the growth of a school, and that will have also consequences for media. If people want to watch YouTube videos, okay, a school can put together a lot of very educational, interesting, aesthetic YouTube videos all the time. Individuals can't. I work, I do other stuff, like I do the best I can with producing content. Maybe I don't. Maybe I could do a little bit better. But anyway, I work a lot. I have a family, I do chores, I have a lot going on. I practice classical music, like this. I played the Baroque flute. Schopenhauer played the flute. King Frederick the Great of Prussia played the flute. I practice King Frederick the Great's flute exercises, different stuff. Someone has to keep this shit alive. Do you get what I'm saying? Someone has to. I try. I am trying. That's what I'm trying to do. So it's up to you whether this stuff is carried forward into the future. You could help a school be established. If you want to support, that's my goal. I don't know who else has that same goal. Support them or me or both, or communicate with us so that we build the best possible plan to actually create this. It has to be created. It is not optional. If you care about Western civilization, you have to build schools where the traditions that constitute Western civilization are taught. It has to be taught to the next generation in a coherent way and made widely available and actually forced in people's lives and faces and town squares where they can't ignore it. A guerrilla marketing strategy of what was great in Western civilization has massive potential for monetization as well as for shaping culture. We can still do it. Don't give up. But you have to do something. You specifically have to support this or some other project and not just continue to watch YouTube videos. The people who are just making content online and not building real institutions have to stop taking people's money and draining resources from others. You have to build something that will allow other people to gain energy. Build communities, schools. The school is the most important thing. Talk to me about it if you want to learn more about it, or if you want to shape my thinking on it. My Skype will be in the description. My PayPal will be in the description if you want to really donate and help build this. It's not going to be used for my personal expenses. It's for the school. Everything I'm doing for the last 10 years has all been about getting ready for building this school. My Patreon will be there. That's more just to support me as a creator so that I'm incentivized to do this, so that I can make time to do this, so that hopefully one day I can stop working as many hours as I do and I can make more time for this kind of content, also the kind of speculation that I have a lot of interests and a lot of things that I can talk about. So if you want to support me, if you want to support the school project, or if you just want to talk, those links will be in the description. Thank you guys for listening. It's not too late. We can still do something, but you have to do something. Thank you for listening.